What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see.
Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. Dean Spade is back on. My good friend who was on one of the most popular episodes of the podcast on the nonprofit industrial complex. We'll link to that in the show notes. But on this one, we're going to talk about how we stay focused in times of intense repression, like now. Specifically, he and some friends put together a list of 5 questions that we could all ask ourselves so we don't reproduce the language and the ideas of the cops, the states, and generally all the people who benefit from a system where most wealth and power are held by a few people. These are some things that Dean and others were thinking about as the indictment, the absurd indictment against Cop City protesters in Atlanta came out. But these questions are applicable to any movements where you're wrestling with taking power from people who are hoarding it, not just cops, Zionists, landlords, politicians, CEOs, all of your favorite villains. And really quick, before the conversation begins, here's where I'm going to ask you to go to patreon.com/SadFrancisco. All of our past episodes live there. And if you throw us $5 or more, you'll get a bonus episode every month where we answer people's questions. And it's like a tip for Tofu, the editor, and I. For the most part, this is a 2-person operation, but our friends who are guests and people who are members are huge supports for this project that we want to make long term, especially as traditional media kind of falls away. And I say this as somebody who's worked for 20 years writing for newspapers and websites, alternative forms of media like this podcast, our friends' podcasts, even some of the social media that we do. We're hoping to get information across that old media in many cases is failing to get to you. Here's one of the smartest, most captivating people that I know, Dean Spade. Dean, your episode on the nonprofit industrial complex remains, I think, the most popular episode of this podcast.
Wow, I'm honored.
So I'm really excited to have you back up on this new tool that you and Zora Ahmed and Jocelyn Simonson put together along with Billy D and Darby Kim.
And people from Community Justice Exchange, Atara and Pilar.
Cool. Yeah, it's a guide, like a very, very quick guide that comes in the form of like a printable zine that you can carry with you on anti-repression techniques. It feels like this would have been very helpful to have recently at some Palestine solidarity actions that I was part of. Yeah, because the state has figured out so many different ways to try to tear apart our movements. And, you know, sometimes we're doing the FBI's job for them, it feels like. And these questions, I feel like, are helpful to help us like not do that. Anyway, thank you, Dean, for coming on. Could you talk about how the project came to be?
What happened was like around the time when the Stop Cop City defendants were indicted, 61 people were indicted who'd all been part of that campaign to stop that new police training facility from being built over the forest in Atlanta. And, this huge, outrageous indictment, this like wild document that I recommend everybody read that, shows us what our opponents, how our opponents assess our politics. Quite interesting. Anyway, this huge document in which the kind of they're trying to paint a conspiracy between all the people in the campaign to stop Cop City, and so they're tying together like people who posted things on the internet telling people to come to gatherings, people who sabotaged construction equipment, people who flyered about the campaign. Like they're saying all these people, whether or not their individual acts look like crimes, are part of a criminal conspiracy. And that conspiracy, is charity fraud because these people are raising money for their bail fund, and so they're engaged in charity fraud because they're actually anarchists who are trying to destroy the U.S. government, et cetera. It's really wild to see how they play it all out. What they use all these terms from our movements, and anyway, it's really a juicy read. But when that came out, it's obviously a really outrageous, outstanding moment of political repression, very visible, and a lot of commentary came out about it, like people being, all kinds of people who are in general, trying to say this is terrible and shouldn't happen, but saying a lot of classic things people say, like. Taking individuals like this individual was just flyering, and that's their First Amendment right, or kind of like exceptionalizing certain people as if certain people shouldn't be part of this, moment of repression because what they did was, guaranteed by our Constitution, as if that's a thing that has ever meant anything in this place. Or anywhere, honestly, or saying, like really respond. I just saw all these like very well-meaning people responding to the indictment with talking points that actually affirm the government's repressive agenda, that say that some people should be criminalized for their resistance activity, that our institutions are whole and correct and right, and this is an outrage, this is an unusual thing that's happening, as opposed to actually this is exactly how movements have been treated, from jump, and this is actually how the United States government works, is through lawlessness, like a very, very lawless, highly targeted apparatus of criminalization. And so even some of the people who are my collaborators on this document, I wrote to them and I was like, hey, the thing you wrote feels like this to me. I really don't think that's what you mean to say. And I also see people writing things like, Stop Cop City people aren't anarchists, like trying to defend Stop Cop City participants by distancing
such a bad word, right?
Yeah, right. All this kind of classic stuff. And so anyway, I reached out to some of these. I was talking to Pilar from CJE about my concerns, and I reached out to some people who I saw writing things like that, who I really see as like my fellow traveler abolitionists, and we ended up in a conversation where we're like, this is a hard, thorny thing. Why don't we create like a very simple tool for other people navigating how to comment on political repression? Because it's going to keep mounting. Like, we are living in times that are so brutal, and there's going to be a lot of mobilization because of that, and there's going to be a lot of repression. And since we then immediately saw more and more of that, it's just continued and continued. I mean, we wrote the talking points about not pretending the university is a neutral or fair place, usually, except for this one time before the encampments started. These are just classic. These things happen again and again and again. So yeah, it came out of just one instance of seeing that, and our audience for this was like really wanting people engaged in any kind of talking about repression, whether that's you're writing chants for what's going to be chanted at the march you're going to, or you're putting stuff on social media, or you're a journalist, or you're, we also wanted to specifically write to people who are like public defenders and legal scholars and other legal types, often write some of the worst, fall into these traps the worst. They get, and you feel you're reading the indictment and you're like, God, this whole thing is so absurd, even for this absurd system. So it's easy to want to talk in the system's language and be like, First Amendment, blah, blah, blah. And so trying to help people distinguish, when you're in a moment of doing actual advocacy for someone in a courtroom, you may actually use the arguments inside the system. But when you're talking about the system inside our movements and you use those same talking points, it actually affirms the legitimacy of that system and affirms its right to criminalize our people. And so just really trying to help people distinguish like and so we're actually going to do a webinar coming up in the fall that's specifically for lawyers and legal scholars and law students about that thorny issue. How do you learn how to talk one way in the courtroom and a different way when you're, or it may not be a courtroom, it may be like an administrative hearing at a university for students who are being expelled or whatever. How do you talk one way in those spaces and another way when you're speaking in public about our movements, so that you don't like throw people under the bus?
Yeah, that's so important, especially, like what we've seen since last October and before that with things like Cop City, but like particularly around Palestine, like there's so much lawfare happening, like people basically using the law and their ability to pay lawyers endlessly to try to stop any, Palestine solidarity action from happening. We see that with the way that people's bails are set really high, or these changing definitions of what what is discrimination. Like I saw that NYU is now considering like Zionism or Zionists a protected class, just like
Wow.
women or like people of color. So that's a problem. And these questions help us, I think, get to whether or not the actions that we're taking as people who are working against oppression, like how we can avoid those pitfalls. And before we get to the questions, yeah, I was wondering, like, so gay shame here in San Francisco, we are in the process of putting together like documents outlining some examples. Not sure if we're going to name any names, but talking about counter-revolutionary actions that we've experienced in the past year or so. How have you seen repression play out as you've been doing Palestine solidarity work? Are there any like new ways that you've seen it play out, or is it kind of like the same old stories recycled?
It's interesting when you just said the thing about lawfare. It actually brought me back to, do you remember? I mean, it was several years ago when the American Studies Association passed some kind of resolution to honor the academic boycott of
Yeah.
Israel. And the people I knew who were on like whatever the governing boards were then, like they all got sued within an inch of their lives. Like I remember people, I won't name names, having to like turn over every email they'd written. Like, I mean, just the kinds of like you're saying, like the kind of legal harassment. So there's like of course the government legal harassment that's happening all the time with the like actual criminalization of our people for everything. But then there's also this like thing where like designers are doing now, like endlessly suing universities, endlessly suing anybody who they can to get at any anti-Zionist organizing happening inside those spaces. And yeah, they're relentless. I mean, similar to the government, they have, seemingly like endless resources for this. And we really don't, like on our side, like we really, like as somebody who spent a lot of time trying to organize legal support for our side of anything. Yeah, we don't have it. It's really, really, really hard, like to even organize, like, just the most basic legal support for like, groups like the 61 defendants in Atlanta, like the number of people who have worked so hard to make sure there can be enough attorneys for those people who are able to do this kind of, very serious RICO case, et cetera. It's really a lot. So yeah, I think that's happening all over the place. It's also fascinating right now to watch some of these institutions scramble. Like I didn't know the thing you just said about NYU making Zionists a protected class. I mean, it gives us a good barometer. I mean, obviously in so many ways that stuff was already true, but they're making it all explicit. Or like I've seen like one university that I engage with a lot. They got scared that people in their own departments and centers could post their own events and things on their own websites. That's how it always been. It'd been like you post your own, you update your own part of the university website to be like, oh, our class is this time and our meeting is going to be at this time. And they like took that control away because they are like, oh my God, all these people could say anything. They could say that the SJP is having a meeting. They could say that they're having an event about Gaza. And just watching how they don't have the capacity to have as much total control as they feel they now need to, and they're being sued by Zionists, and every single thing they do is being made into some kind of discrimination complaint or whatever, and some of them are having to like go before Congress or whatever. So it is just like, I mean, there's one place I work with a lot where like they're having this debate with the university about whether or not they're allowed to schedule meetings in their own conference room of their tiny center. You know what I mean? Like, and like literally that, because the university is like, we associate you with possibly having co-organized events that in any way included a Palestinian scholar or student ever in the history of time. And so it's just, to me, it's just like in some ways watching all these institutions like really show their asses. I think that's really helpful. Like there's a lot of, I think one of the things I experience a lot when I am engaging with like liberal Zionists in the communities I'm in is that they want to be like, I'm not a Zionist. Like there's a kind of like desire to like back off. Like, why are you making this into a binary? There's a lot of this. And I'm like, oh, things are getting much clearer. And I hope that that's building a lot of political discernment. I actually think it is. I'm seeing a lot of increased political discernment in a lot of political spaces. Like having been doing this work for a couple of decades and seeing like a lot more people are able to spot and understand how liberal Zionism works, how co-optation works. I also think that co-optation is on the move, though. I'm seeing more liberal Zionists trying to be like, we're creating a non-Zionist space, which means we'll never, ever, ever take a stand against genocide, but we will try to get a few anti-Zionists in the space too, so that we can be like,
Yeah.
look, we coexist here. So that's like a new front, because especially in Jewish spaces, it used to be like, if you're anti-Zionist, like you are out, you're dead to us, never. And now they're like, oh, maybe we'll have you guys, why don't one of you come and
Yeah, one of you on
like
the panel. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so that is, I mean, all of that we got to keep our, and that's very similar to exactly the way that neoliberals co-opt anti-racism, feminism, queer and trans stuff, whatever. But I didn't know it. I didn't know I was going to live to see it around this issue, which usually had been like they don't want to co-opt us at all. They want us to like, be on the other side.
I mean, that means, yeah, like that the movement has gained something, like that there has been ground gained to the point where, Zionists have been pushed to, like you said, yeah, like this deeper level of co-optation. I don't know if that's how best to describe it, but
It's
it's
hard. It's like
true.
you want to like kind of acknowledge it as us gaining strength, and on the other hand, it's like, God, are we really actually winning anything? And also, they sometimes so effectively control us with their little co-optation moves. I think a lot of communities I'm in, we're just trying to work that through. Like, okay, keep standing up to them, even though they said something nice or invited somebody to the panel. Like
Right.
just I think there's just a lot. I mean, whatever. It's just the nature of new when they use new tactics, we have to do a lot with each other to catch up. And there's a lot of new people in our movements right now, which is so awesome. But also helping them catch up to these classic tactics, because
Sure.
I think it's easy to just, we're all constantly undoing liberal and neoliberal thinking in our minds. And so, you know, how do we make sure we are not falling back into the traps that they're laying for us at all times?
And that's why these questions are so helpful. So we could start with number one, and I can just read them, and maybe you could talk about like, yeah, how this came to be one of the five. So number one is, does this argument erase or ignore the ongoing violence of the U.S. colonial legal system or legitimize that system?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I also too want to encourage people. We made these like we made like an Instagram slide deck, and there's like kind of visuals for each of these questions that we worked really hard on with Billy D, and it was really fun to try to be like, how do you make this image? And so this image is like of, very kind of like militarized looking lawyers holding legal briefs standing in front of a courthouse, and then behind it looks all very like, proper, but also kind of copy, right? And then behind that courthouse in, this kind of orange relief is like what this courthouse really stands for, which is like bombing and extracting and prisons and cops beating people up, and and that's what this question is about like how frequently people make arguments like, the repressive thing happens, the kids are kicked out of school for their protest, or the people are given outrageous charges after the march, or whatever it is, and people say things like, this is not what our justice system looks like, or this is a threat to our democracy, and it kind of acts as if the system is usually fair and like usually operates democratically, except this time, and that's why it's an outrage. And so part of what we're trying to encourage people to do is to instead of acting like this current repression is out of step, to make, to instead, when we talk about repression, be like, oh, this is connected to long histories of this repression, right? So we're not going to like pretend this isn't happening to lots and lots of people and hasn't been happening to lots and lots of people. Even if we want to name the internal inconsistencies of the legal system, like, of course, yes, we want to be like, wow, look at how the legal system treats, white collar criminals, and how it treats, people in our communities, or how it treats right wingers who, go into the streets versus how it treats our people, whatever. We want to be like, those inconsistencies are what the system was designed to do, not like some shocking departure. And I think that is hard. And then the third piece is that, people really over rely on like calling on like free speech. I always think about the Young Lords, some speech that Juan Gonzalez gave like in the 70s for the Young Lords, that I often teach to my students, because he just breaks down how like the idea of universal rights is, I mean, many people have, but is so ridiculous. Like the idea that there's free speech in the United States, there's never been free speech. There's like certain people's speech goes far and wide, is backed by all of their money, and other people are, literally living inside a cage, and that, and, punished for every form of expression, from get. And that has always been the way it is. And so the idea, whenever we like call on universal rights, we are participating in a fiction that is what this is, that's ever existed here, that could exist here, which I think is just like a very harmful fiction. that
Yeah.
is, you know,
Yeah.
deeply anti-Black and deeply anti-Indigenous and colonial. And so we just want to like, is the way I'm saying this pretending that free speech exists, that it's a national value, that it's been guaranteed to people until this terrible instance, or or except for these few exceptions? Like, we just want to get away from anything that legitimizes a system that we know
Yeah.
is murder.
It's like the ultimate gaslight. So this like tool, like in particular, is going to be so helpful for a lot of people who are coming back. And I know that there's already plans to set up more encampments, and people are going to be organizing, whether the state or these administrations at these colleges like it or not. So number two is, does this argument contribute to a false narrative that universities and colleges are neutral spaces for the free exchange of ideas?
Yeah. And this is the same thing. You often hear people say something like, the university's commitment to academic freedom must be upheld, like as if that is a thing, right? And like for me, this one is really shocking because it's almost as if people are imagining that anyone can walk into a university and say and do anything. In reality, the university is a highly curated space. There's nothing free about it. They hire some people, they don't hire others. They let some people in, they don't let other people in. They have some events, they don't have other events. Like it is. It's not a free exchange of ideas. It's a space that's got an agenda. That agenda is to put students into certain kinds of industries. It's to develop certain kinds of research for the military and for big pharma. It's to, it's to do its colonial project that it was founded to do in the case of, the US universities. And so there's a kind of way in which this, again, it's about saying this is an exception. And usually it's this wonderful place where students go to grow and learn. And it's like, yes, sometimes we have good experiences in the university, just like we do at our shitty jobs and like everywhere. You can have good experience anywhere. And I work in a university and it's very meaningful to me to like and try to engage certain things in the classroom. But I'm not under the impression that the university like exists for the free exchange of ideas. And I think that is just so important to be careful about, because this image that goes with this question is an image where it's kind of a split screen. On the one hand, you've got the fantasy where it's like the university's all these graduates, they've got balloons, they're smiling, and the other side of the screen is like the reality of the university, which is like we kind of adapted that image of the cop pepper spraying people, I think at UC Davis several years ago. We've got like scary kind of like administrators walking through. We've got riot cops approaching students. Like that's really what the history of the university is in the US, and there's nothing new about people being silenced and criminalized. I do think we're in a moment where the gloves are off in a certain way compared to other times in my life. Like I think that we're in a moment where more intensively universities are willing to let people be permanently expelled. There have been periods at some universities in some movements where you could kind of like, well, they still want the students to graduate, so they'll eventually, and I think that they do not care about that right now. Again, showing their asses. And that is useful. And all the more reason not to pretend the university is something it's not when we talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Tofu here, co-producer of San Francisco, trying to pay rent again by doing another ad break. As always, you can sign up for our Patreon, patreon.com/San Francisco. There you can get early access to episodes and also exclusive behind-the-scenes content. If you're watching this episode on YouTube, you might realize that we're integrating more visual aid and motion graphics so that we can make the information on the podcast more comprehensible and accessible. Doing these kinds of edits is like adding graphs, pictures, or any other visual aid in a textbook, so it's not just a boring wall of text. In the description of our YouTube video, there will be links to all the sources of each graphic we used and timestamps to when it was referenced within the video. Just a little more accessibility I like to do. So sign up for the Patreon if you want to support Toshio and I with the production, research, and editing for each episode. And as always, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and on our YouTube channel for additional content and for more information on the show. And lastly, if you're listening to this on audio platforms, give us a rating. And if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and like the video. Thanks again for all the growth on all of our platforms, and we are incredibly grateful for all of your support. Okay, ad break done. Thanks for helping me pay my bills, and now back to the episode.
Question 3. Does this statement participate in dividing people engaged in resistance into good or bad, violent or nonviolent, thereby legitimizing criminalization of people using bolder tactics?
Yeah, so this, I mean, this often comes out as someone says something like, these people aren't criminals. They weren't damaging property. They were just speaking their minds, and it's like, actually, some people are damaging property. And that is also people we want to have the backs of. Like most of these kind of, good protester, bad protester talking points, just really legitimize the government going after people who are doing the more urgent, militant things that actually really need to be done, in my opinion. And one of the things that is just like literally everywhere, Toshio, that I would like do anything to make stop is almost everybody uses the word peaceful protest. And it's used to legitimize the protest and say that it was okay and the cops shouldn't have done anything. And what that says is that we should always be peaceful, even though they are always violent. And actually, like, it undermines the entire history of militant resistance from every movement in the world. Like, we are not obligated to always be peaceful. It is acceptable to engage in like very significant direct action to stop harm and death and colonization and genocide and destruction of people and the planet. It's actually vital right now that people do everything we can, because we are living like right at the edge. And so so when we say peaceful, peaceful, peaceful over and over again, we're saying this protest was peaceful, but if it was not peaceful, then it would be okay what the cops did. And so that's just got to stop. Nonviolent protests, same thing. Like the cops are the ones who decide what gets labeled violence in the courts. It's not violent when they abduct you and put you in a cage, apparently, but it is violent if you push over a trash can during the course of your,
Right.
or smash an ATM, right? And so, or throw their tear canister back at them, right? Things that we should absolutely be doing. So I think that it's really essential to like, I mean, if I could just have like a bleep happen every single time somebody writes peaceful protest, a journalist says it, it goes on an Instagram, post or whatever. It's just it's anti-solidarity, and it's unnecessary. Like, it's usually just not needed in the sentence. As a writer and speaker, we can just as easily say, like, yes, they were focus your talking points on what they were doing. They were trying to stop this leaky pipeline from going through their land. They were trying to stop a genocide. They were trying to stop, like, actually talk about what we believe and get our points across instead of giving the state's talking points. The state's talking points are, if you step out of line according to us, then you deserve to be smashed. And we disagree.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, in media in particular, people are doing this all the time. And I think it's probably in some cases journalists trying to be nice to the protesters. There is,
it is.
Yeah, so much. And then, with protesters themselves, like a lot of kind of like, I don't know if it's self-censorship, but it's like definitely sabotage for the movement over time if this becomes the norm, that we're letting, by using peaceful and defining our own movements as peaceful in the way that it has been used. It does feel like we're letting the opposition kind of they get to define what's peaceful, what's violent currently, and that needs to stop.
Yeah, and this goes into all the stuff we're having in our movements, the dilemmas about whether or not it's okay for people to show up and use bolder tactics at gatherings, and the kind of debates. I think people really internalize this and are like, we have to keep our protest peaceful and we have to keep it safe for everybody there. First of all, you cannot guarantee safety for anybody. Right. And that is I think that can be a big trap for new people to believe they've been guaranteed. Nobody can fucking predict what the cops are going to do to anybody at any time. And secondly, like, the idea that we become literally an extension of the police rules and of the rules of private property and tell people what they can and can't do when gathering. I mean, I'm just very, very concerned about that. Certainly, we should all be like really smart about how to like look out for each other in every space and decide when the right times and places are for different tactics. But we're not anywhere near that level of refined thought about it. It's just this kind of like, people just have this like sweeping belief in the idea of peaceful protest, which is just, I mean, it's deeply, 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 to me, it's deeply anti-Black, because it's about how in the US, the history of Black people rioting against white supremacy and standing up against police is framed as a criminality. That was a big win after the 1960s and 70s, is that the United States like drastically increased the criminal system and really reframed Black resistance of all kinds as just ordinary criminality instead of as a political project of resistance, and really convinced, changed the kind of national narrative about that, even more severely, and deepened it and materially deepened it with the expansion of the prison system. And so to me, it really feels like when people say peaceful protest specifically, they are like calling on this long history of state propaganda against Black resistance. It's not exclusively about Black resistance, it's all resistance, but I feel like in the national imagination, it's specifically about crushing Black resistance.
Yeah. So you did launch for this a couple months back that we'll link in the show notes. And you spoke about peace policing that can happen at protests, for example. Would you define that for people who maybe this is like the first time that they're getting involved is like Palestine solidarity protests?
Yes, I have not thought like deeply enough about how I would like properly define that if I was like writing this down, but I'll tell you in my mind what it means to me colloquially. It's just the term I've heard people use for my whole time in movements for when we are together at a protest or action of some kind and we're trying to boss each other around about following rules. And so that I start to be like, I mean, the lighter versions might be that I ask you to leave if you're, wearing a lot of black and covering your face, or that I tell you, I try to stop you personally from smashing something up or whatever. But the worst versions are that I actually rat you out to the cops. Like that happens too, And like what we want to be doing is creating an environment where those of us who are taking less risk are in solidarity with those who choose to take more risk. And even if we don't exactly agree with what they decided to do, they're still ours. We are with them, not the cops, So peace policing is those moments. And it looks like a lot of things. People call it different things, peace policing. But yeah, like it's just like sometimes it's because a group has actually set people up to be in the role of telling each other what to do, to try to control the crowd. And sometimes it's just like something people are just on their own, just trying to stop others because they deeply feel like it's going to be bad for the group and it'll look bad. A lot of it's about optics too, which is just really gross. It's like, it's one thing if you're like, hey, I'm really concerned that you're endangering someone else's safety if you do this thing right now. Can we talk about it? We can try to influence each other and ultimately we cannot control each other. But it's another thing if you're just like, I just think maybe theoretically the media might see you do that or wear that or say that, and it'll make me not look as legitimate to like the most mainstream government ideas. That is like not okay.
Yeah. I feel like that was a good definition. Question 4 is, does this statement reinforce boogeyman terms and tropes that our opposition is using to delegitimize our movements and justify repression?
Yeah, we put this one in particular. So this does an image of like, there's a bunch of people in a tree doing some kind of maybe tree sit and banner drop. And there's like a politician standing at a podium calling them dangerous anarchists. And there's cops behind him thinking that they're trespassers and terrorists. And then there's a person regarding the group and thinking that they're brave resistors. And what we're trying to get across here is just that like the government uses these kind of like, terms, like they use terms like terrorist and anarchist to really try to, scare people. And there sometimes, again, well-meaning people will be like, they're not terrorists, they're not anarchists, instead of contending, instead of actually trying to, or they're not, they weren't throwing Molotov cocktails, or, they're not black radicals, or whatever the term is that the government is using as a scare tactic. When in reality, we don't want to distance ourselves from those categories because because some of us are some of those things sometimes, like of course many people in our movements do identify as anarchists or do identify as radicals or do throw Molotov cocktails or whatever, and because we like empower that fear. We're like, if we say like we're not those things, not only do we throw those people under the bus who may actually be those things, and there's always the question of like, do you actually even know what those words mean? Have you actually, are you just believing the repression stories about what those words mean? I think that I've been shocked by that. Also, like, again, our job when we're talking about our movements is to redirect back to what this is about. What's really terrifying is this pipeline. What's really violent and horrible is bombing people in Gaza. Like actually all of their violence is much worse. All of their they're also much more lawless than us. I mean, I wish I could say we were as lawless as them, but our opponents are actually, they pollute whatever they want. They bomb whatever they want. They don't care about international law. They don't care about domestic law. And so whenever we kind of are like, no, we agree. Yes, lawfulness is good. And we swear we're all lawful, or we're all under control, or we're all, proper Democrats, or whatever the story is, it's really, it has a pedagogy that's bad for our movements, and it like is actually dangerous because it's, they want. I had a really interesting story from somebody who was part of a really big protest where then there was in Canada many years back, where there was then a really severe targeting of a set of people who'd been involved. and the government was targeting them and calling them anarchists. And they were trying to get people to be like, we're all anarchists, instead of being like, no, they're not anarchists. They were trying to get the narrative to switch amongst just like a variety of people in their movements. And what they ran up against is people really don't know what that word means. And we're like not able to just be like, yeah, we're just going to stand in solidarity with you and say, if you're calling our friends this word as a scare tactic, we're all that, like, which I think that's that's the kind of solidarity we're seeking, is like, yes, I am connected with people who you are calling terrorists, who you are calling anarchists, who you are calling radicals. And yes, we stand with them and we believe in what they're doing. That's the move, not the, no, they weren't that,
Yeah. Absolutely. So last question. Does this argument focus too narrowly on procedure, as if the repression would be acceptable if not for this procedural flaw?
Yeah, this happens a lot. It's very easy to fall into this trap because, of course, they are doing all these horrible things very specifically. And it's like, especially I think if you're somebody who's in the weeds with law, like you've done a lot of legal advocacy for other people, or you know that system, it's really easy to be like, oh my God, and they also did this ridiculous thing. They used this ridiculous charge, or this is so unusual, or they didn't give them, this procedure that they should have. And I just think it's okay to point that out, of course, but we've got to do it in a way that doesn't suggest that the government's actions would be fine if they had done that,
Right.
So it can't, it can't be like, oh no, they brought this outside the statute of limitations. It's like, that's not the biggest problem, And so it's okay to name how unusual the procedures were if they, help build, as long as you're building a case of like, this repression is so awful. Our people, get off their backs. But because even if they do the procedures perfectly, we're not into it. So it's just like how to find a way to really, when you've got that procedural argument in your mind, not lead with it, not center it in a way that makes it sound like if they did the procedures right, it would be completely fine for them to, come after us.
It's like the argument between like Democrats and Republicans, and like, the Democrats might like, I feel like it's the liberal argument is that, yeah, if we're saying thing in a way that's more like civil, or has the air of civility around it, then it's acceptable. But it gets you away from the actual argument, and it's like so much focus on these flourishes, and can end up just totally derailing and taking up so much time.
Yeah. It's also just completely tied in with the fantasy. I mean, the fundamental liberalism that I think almost everybody is attached to still is that the legal system could work well if the right people were the judges, if the right people were the lawyers, if we had the right president, if, this kind of, it's like, and, for years and years, as you know, so much of what I focus on is having people let go of legal reform as the way through. Like, it's like, in the image we have with this particular question, it's like this judge and this lawyer like leaning closely together, like, oh, like they could collaborate and come up with like a good answer, like that kind of fantasy of having like a softer, kinder court system, or having like a legislature that really gets us, or having anything like, I don't know, like it's that fantasy is driving so much anti-solidarity, and it's really misdirecting our movements. It leads us to bad ideas about what to do next, and we don't have a lot of time to figure it out. And so it's like all this like investment in trying to get those systems to work right, get the right people in them. And maybe if we made the right argument, I mean, I remember feeling this way when I was a very young person, like trying to learn about the legal system and learning about different kinds of oppression, and being like, oh my God. I mean, I remember like when I was like 16, like went to the library and like read Roe versus Wade, and like just being like, okay, if you make the right arguments, you can make the system work right and get people what they want. It's just like, it's not true. Like, it's not legitimate. And if we could just like let it go, we can see so much more clearly like who our opponents are and what we need to do to stop them, and that it's not going to ever be through their procedures. And it's like, I realize it's like, I can say this, I'll be saying this the rest of my life until I like die of starvation and collapse with everyone else. But like, it's just like, or whatever other horrible end will soon meet us. But it's just, it's so painful to watch the deep investment in, and one other thing I just want to say about this, Toshio, is like this moment. I had this moment where I saw like a clip of Kamala Harris giving a speech. It was a couple weeks ago now, closer to the beginning of the time when she became the candidate, giving some kind of speech where she was talking about like how she wants to be like tougher on immigrants than Donald Trump or something. And like the whole crowd was cheering. And I was thinking about who's in that crowd and how they could cheer that, like, and I was just thinking about this kind of very shallow type of politics we have a lot in the US, where people have an issue-based politics, but no broader politics. So they're like, okay, they'll have some kind of basic like policing is racist and bad. Maybe they now have like a free Palestine. They have like a abortion, yes. Like they got it's all these, trans people are okay. All these separate issues, but no actual guiding politics that indicts the US itself and that understands the problems with like the US colonial project, the problem of the nation state. And so then you can easily manipulate. You're like, I see Kamala. I see a Black woman for president. I see her saying some things I like. She's saying hate immigrants. I guess I'll cheer. You know what I mean? Like it just becomes, it's just the solidarities are very, 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 very frail and thin, loose, because there's no deeper assessment. And then when somebody says, yeah, let's push for we should indict the cops instead. And you're like, yeah, instead of being like, oh, wait, no, that's never going to work. I don't actually believe in that. And then when somebody's like, our protesters were peaceful, you're like, yeah, like it's just this kind of like the liberalism is still guiding the entire framework, even if you've got some what appear to be kind of radical individual issues that you care about. And I feel very worried about that. And I'm hoping this guide is helping people, if to the extent that obviously it's just like one little tool, but I hope that it helps some people. I hope its brevity helps people crystallize a little bit, kind of a more anti-law enforcement, anti-law take on how we respond to political repression. And just really knowing that those people are not on our side. Those systems couldn't possibly deliver freedom, and all their promises of freedom are not things that we like repeat and regurgitate and invest in, because they're not true.
Reasons why I'm an anarchist. And if people are interested, they should go back and listen to the episode with Edxi from a couple of weeks back about, why not to vote and legitimize the system that we're living in. But thank you so much, Dean, for taking us through. People can find the guide. It's called 5 Questions for Cultivating Solidarity When Responding to Political Repression. Everybody print it out, keep it in your pocket as you're organizing this fall. It'll be in the show notes. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks so much, Toshio. Good to talk to you. Thanks for doing this podcast.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/SadFrancisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early, and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.